Welcome to another episode of Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Ryan Evans. I serve, among many other things, as the publisher of the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org. In this episode, Ben Griffin of West Point delivers a gripping talk on his book, Reagan's War Stories, A Cold War Presidency. I highly recommend this book. Several popular writers appear throughout the book, writers whom I know our readers will know and be familiar with. In a part of this episode, Ben focuses on the relationship between one of these authors, Tom Clancy, and Reagan, and how the president saw Clancy's book, Red Storm Rising, as a credible war game that influenced his negotiations with Gorbachev over nuclear weapons. Of course, any views expressed by Ben are his own, and not those of the U.S. Military Academy, the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, or any part of the U.S. government.
I think where I want to start with this is kind of talk about the origins of the project, because I think that'll sort of help me set up the initial kind of concept for it. So I came to Texas expecting to write something entirely different. I came here expecting that I was going to write about the role of the Army in kind of post-conflict operations, because it's something that was really important and relevant to me as a professional, and I thought we don't talk about that enough. Then I started talking to people here and realized that, man, that is really, really boring, that no one wants to listen to that, and also that for me to do it right, I wouldn't be able to do it in the time that I had. And so I went back to an old project I had that looked at novels of Ian Fleming's James Bond books and Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer novels, and how they took in kind of things from the contemporary environment to make their novels more realistic and more relevant to have a broader audience. And then realized that, well, Kennedy was a big fan of Fleming, George Marshall was a big fan of Spillane, and maybe there's something in this linkage between policymakers and fiction, right? Policymakers and these non-traditional sources that Jeremy spoke of. And so I came back, I told Jeremy that I was going to toss the old project and do this new one. He was like, thank God. He did not want anything to do with that, but he was very kind in encouraging me along that path. And so as I looked at this, I thought there had to be something between Ronald Reagan and Tom Clancy. Because those of you who have read Clancy, you know that his novels have a couple of things that are always very true. A, everyone that is wearing the uniform of an American service member is just outstanding. Right? They are the best people in the world. There's not a bad trait about them. If you read The Hunt for October, I think the worst thing that's said about a Navy admiral is that he's a jerk to work for, but gets results, right? So even when you're saying that he's kind of tough to work for, he's still really, really capable and good at his job. The other thing that comes true in all of Clancy's novels is that American military technology is the thing that wins the day, right? So this perfect weapon in the hand of these virtuous soldiers, airmen, and sailors is what's going to achieve these lasting and important strategic effects. And the U.S. always wins. The guys always win in a Tom Clancy novel. And that, to me, kind of embodied what Reagan's message was as a president, right? He comes into office in his first term, and he's all about trying to restore sort of the prestige of the military in the wake of Vietnam in the 1970s. But then also we talk about the great splurge of military spending that decade and kind of the birth of much of the modern military that in the Army we're still fighting with, right? The M1 tank, the UH-60, the Bradley, the Patriot. These are all systems that come out in large numbers in the 1980s that we are still fighting with as the backbone of our force today. And so I thought there had to be something there. And it turns out there was. As I'm doing my initial research, I come across how Ronald Reagan starts praising The Hunt for October in February and March 1985. At a press conference, he called the book unputdownable. In an interview, he called it the perfect yarn. And so it starts getting some traction in the local press as everyone's realizing that the president is praising this book by an obscure insurance salesman from Maryland, because Clancy doesn't really have much of a writing background prior to The Hunt for October. He gets to go to the White House, he meets with Reagan, and the week after his meeting with Reagan, he appears on the bestseller list for the first time. But it's not just Reagan that latches on to Clancy in this time period. So as I'm digging more and looking more, there are book reviews that pop up by Cap Weinberger, who's Secretary of Defense, appears in the Wall Street Journal, the Times Literary Supplement, and he is calling The Hunt for October something that anyone who cares about national security needs to read and take seriously. Right, so now you have what is kind of a very official administration push for this story that kind of captures, I think, what is the essence of Reagan's first term. And so I think when I stumbled onto those, I thought I really had something and decided to move from focus broadly on policymakers and fiction to just on the Reagan administration and really on Ronald Reagan himself. Because the story that I really wanted to tell with this, and the story that hopefully comes across in the book, is that I think we tend to sell pop culture short, sell the stories that we love, the stories that we enjoy a little bit short, and how they can influence us and shape how we interact with the world and communicate with broader populations, other people. Because really, when I think about creating a strategy, creating a policy, it is inherently an act of fiction. It's an act of writing, right? Because what you're doing is you are imagining a world in the near future, be it 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years from now. You have your end state, this fictional world that you want to create, that you want to operate in. And then you are writing the steps, writing the ways that you are going to make that world come into existence, right? That's all an act of, again, imagination, an act of creation, and that you are hoping that that is where you're going to go, right? You have some hard evidence, perhaps that's the way it's going to be, but in reality, you're projecting a future that doesn't actually exist. And so that imagination is critical. And I think reading fiction does a lot to stimulate that imagination in ways that are good and in ways that are bad, which we'll get into here as we go along. And so then to do this story right, I needed to explain that, okay, Reagan tells stories, that he loves telling stories. And I think that's something that comes across in pretty much all of his public comments, that Reagan is known as a great communicator, and that's because of the way he uses anecdotes, the way that he uses jokes as fables, right? That he's kind of like a modern-day Aesop in that the wrapping doesn't matter so much as what is inside of it. And my favorite example of this is when he's speaking to the Medal of Honor Association at their luncheon. And so he wants to really highlight the differences between the US and the Soviet Union as systems, as peoples. And so he tells a story about coming across a newspaper report about how this Russian-Spanish translator got awarded the Order of the Hero of the Soviet Union, their highest award. And this is confusing to Reagan because, sure, being a translator, being a teacher, that's noble work. I think everyone in here respects that work. It's not typically what we decorate people for with a nation's highest award for gallantry and courage and all of that. So Reagan gave it to a report, dig into it. Turns out this was Ramon Mercader, the person who assassinated Leon Trotsky. All right, and so Reagan's saying, they give their top award to political assassins. And so he tells a story then about a Medal of Honor station he came across in World War II when he was serving out with the Hollywood Motion Picture Unit. And in the citation, there is a B-17 coming back across the English Channel, and it is doomed. It's destroyed. It's not going to make it back to its airbase. And so the pilot gives the order to abandon the craft, and he's at the door with his co-pilot. They're about to jump out when they hear a voice crying out from behind, where the young belly gunner is too wounded to be able to bail out of the aircraft. The boy asks the pilot, "Please don't let me die alone." The pilot says, "Fine," sits down. "We'll ride down together, son." Medal of Honor, posthumous. The U.S. gives their highest award to a man who's wanted to bring comfort to a dying boy. Powerful stuff. Great story. Problem is, that B-17 never existed. Never happened, right? Reagan found that story sometime in the 1940s or 50s, not sure exactly when, but I went through every single Medal of Honor citation in World War II, and that story never occurred. Right? There are cases where pilots try to keep in the plane longer and land it. There are stories where pilots give their parachutes to injured crewmates, but there is no story where they just sit down and write it in. Didn't matter to Reagan, right? It was more about that core message, right? And so that's what stories meant to Reagan. He learned that as a young man, right? The power of stories, right? And so this is then the second part, which then became the first part, if that makes sense, of my novel, right? I had to start with how Reagan learns about the power of storytelling, to then say how he uses storytelling when he becomes the president, right? And so for Reagan, stories were an act of self-creation, right? He comes from a broken household, right? His father was an alcoholic, had difficulty keeping a job in place, and they moved around the Mideast, or Midwest, not the Mideast, whole different story then. Moves around the Midwest from job to job. And so Reagan is lacking what he thinks is an appropriate father figure, and so he finds them in the pages of a couple of books. The first one is That Printer of Udell by Harold Bell Wright. Harold Bell Wright is largely forgotten author, but one of the first American ones to sell 1 million copies of a book. And Reagan credits this book with making him a practical Christian because the story is semi-autobiographical of Wright about how he turned from being a tramp into a local preacher through doing good works rather than just through sitting in church, basically. The other book that Reagan discovers are the stories of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And so usually you hear Burroughs, you think Tarzan. That's his most famous character. But the ones that Reagan really points to are John Carter of Mars. You might remember the terrible Disney movie about 2014, 2015, right? But this is a case where a former Confederate cavalryman is transported to Mars magically, where the lower gravity gives him super strength, super speed, super everything. And he uses his belief in the freedom of America to take over Martian society and make it more democratic and free while marrying the most attractive woman on the planet. Right? Again, powerful stuff for a 10-year-old, perhaps, as they're imagining what they want to be. And so John Carter becomes a central figure for Reagan. And this idea that freedom plus technology equals progress becomes a central tenet of Reagan's political ideology, something that he carries through his entire career. At his commencement address at the Air Force Academy, he makes that very explicit, is that technology plus freedom equals progress. And I think that really does a good job of summarizing the way he viewed the U.S. military and U.S. military force. As he continues through, stories continue to be really important to who Reagan is and how he evolves. Right? His first job is as a sportscaster for radio stations in Iowa, most prominently WHO in Des Moines. His big role there is calling Cubs games, which is great for me because I got to work my love of the Cubs into the project. But it's not the way you think of broadcasting today, where when you're calling a game, you're calling it from the press box at Wrigley Field, and there's only one version of the game. Instead, Reagan's in a small closet in Des Moines getting a telegraph feed, all right, with a little code like 3BC, which means pitch 3, curveball, strike. Not compelling stuff, right? If you're just reading off codes, it's not going to be something that holds your audience in. So what Reagan has to do is make it all up, right? He has to take this one small piece of truth and then tell a mostly-ish accurate story about what's happening in this ball game, right? So if you sat in Wrigley and you watched and then talked to your friend or your family member back in Iowa about the way the game went down, you would both know the final score. You'd know who had the big plays, but that would be it. Everything else would be entirely different versions. It'd be like watching two different versions of the same TV show, right? Or a remake versus the original. It's not quite the same thing, but it's close, right? And so that, to Reagan, is really important, right? And his foundational moment as a broadcaster is when that teletape goes out and he has to call a sequence of 12 pitches. Of course, you can't have 12 pitches in baseball without having a strikeout or a walk and changing the box score unless there's a lot of foul balls. And so that's what he does. It's 12 straight foul balls, right? And one, there's a kid who scrambles in the stands to find and then gets it and is all triumphant. One almost leaves the yard, except it just skirts to the left of the foul pole, right? Tape comes back in. On the first pitch of this sequence, it was a fly ball to left. Agagon flew out on the first pitch, right? So then he calls that in there. But Reagan tells this story about broadcasting over and over again in his life. But what's weird about it to me, as a Cubs fan, right, is he called this game in April. And yeah, it was against the Cardinals, and it was Dizzy Dean on the mound, and it was tied in the ninth. That's all good stuff. But that same season, the Cubs won 19 straight games in September to win the NL pennant and go to the World Series, which meant that Reagan was one of the few people who had called a Cubs World Series game, as he's telling this story to Harry Carey in the booth at WGN. Right? So he's talking about this April game, not the World Series, because at that moment, Reagan was realizing the power of telling the story, the power of wrapping the truth around this fictive kind of wrapper. This carries through in his career in Hollywood, and there he becomes more politically oriented as he becomes the president of the Screen Actors Guild, as he starts working with the House Un-American Activities Committee to talk about communism in Hollywood, as he sees himself combating communism in Hollywood, and reading things like Whittaker Chambers' Witness, reading things like Arthur Kessler's Darkness at Noon, and these are shaping his view that communism is the greatest evil because it is the oppressor of individual freedom and liberty. He takes that forward, and he's looking then in books of Westerns, like novels of Louis L'Amour, Hondo being a favorite of his, and then James Michener's Bridges to Tokari, which is not a Western, but it's a novel of the Korean War that ends rather depressingly with the main pilot being shot and killed on the ground after completing his mission, but only in that moment understanding what the war was all about. But there's a sequence that Reagan goes back to over and over again in this book, and it's the day after this pilot is killed. Admiral Tarrant, who is the commander of the Naval Task Force, standing on the deck of the aircraft carrier watching planes go off and asking himself, where do we get such men? And so Reagan takes that line and he uses it over and over again in his speeches and answers it, right? We find them where we always have, right? In the cities and the towns and the villages across America to show that there's just something special about the American service member, right? And this is all going back to really that first term where he's trying to restore capability and restore the appearance and the impression of the American military. And that comes in clearly in his speech at West Point. And again, as a West Point grad, I got to bring West Point as often as possible. But he gives the commencement address in 1981, his first kind of major foreign policy speech. And in the draft of this speech, there's a paragraph that just excoriates Hollywood. It criticizes the reprehensible pandering to anti-American sentiment that seems to be driving filmmaking in the late 1970s and 80s. And in the margin, you have a couple of films written down: Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter, The Killing Fields. And these are all really, really good movies, but they don't really portray American service members very well. And so Reagan hated this because he knew the power of culture, and that was part of the narrative that he was looking to reverse. And this is kind of where Tom Clancy then enters the stage. Right. So again, I mentioned that he was an insurance agent working in Maryland. He had wanted to perhaps go through ROTC and join the service, but he is blind as a bat and cannot do this. So instead, he settles down with his wife, runs an insurance agency that's kind of halfway between Annapolis and DC, and has a lot of naval officers as his clients. And he continues to have this abiding interest in all things Navy and this abiding interest in all things Republican and Ronald Reagan. So he actually writes and asks for a signed picture of the president before he gets book famous. And gets that because his congressman calls him a reliable Republican in the area, basically. And so he decides that he wants to write a novel. And he works on this thing that's based off of a story of a Soviet frigate that tried to defect the Dorhetsky. That didn't end well for that frigate. But he thought that he put on the sub, and that's a pretty compelling plot device. And so he's going to write this story about a Soviet submarine captain who is going to take this new high-tech sub and secretly defect to the United States. And then everything that follows kind of from that is what drives the plot. But Clancy, not being very experienced, decides that he's going to just drop this off at a publisher to see if they want to take it. And he's in luck, because the Naval Institute Press, which had previously published a letter to the editor, which is the only thing he'd published before that, so there's hope for everyone to write a book and get it out there, had just decided to publish fiction, as long as it was wet, and as long as it's tied to something Navy, and this certainly met that. And so it comes out, and it's doing okay. It's selling reasonably well around Washington, D.C., around Baltimore. They're happy with it, right? But it's not, Tom Clancy international bestseller, Tom Clancy's S power play ops, brand name Tom Clancy yet. But one of Reagan's longtime advisors finds this book. So Nancy Reynolds, who'd been with him when he was the governor of California, finds it and realizes it is the perfect Ronald Reagan story because it meets a couple of criteria, right? First off, that it shows the U.S. military well, right? That it has a clear protagonist who has a strong moral code. That is a white hat, much like and he used to be in the westerns I love, right? He's a Hondo type character where he does the right thing for the right reasons, doesn't care about the credit, and then the good guys win, right? That's always for Reagan. The good guys always have to win, right? You can't countenance the idea that the good guys lose in one of these novels, and so she gets it. She gives it to him for Christmas in 1984, and then Reagan stays up late, stays up to like 3:30 in the morning reading this novel. Goes to a meeting the next day and has to apologize to his staff. Hey, look, I'm so tired. It's my fault. I was just reading this book, right? And so the staff gets the message like, oh, okay, boss likes this. Time to go out and read it, right? And that starts this press buildup that then leads to Tom Clancy, international bestseller. And then he gets to go to the White House and they talk about his next book, which is going to be Red Storm Rising, which he writes with Larry Bond. And they talk about it, and Reagan says he loves the technology, and Clancy says, oh, that's the easy part. Writing dialogue is hard, which fans of Clancy know is true. And so, Reagan's interested. Is, okay, but who wins? And Clancy said, well, the good guys, obviously. All right? And so this next book comes out, August of 1986, Red Storm Rising, and it is a fictional World War III, obviously fictional, it has been World War III, right? But it's a World War III scenario where NATO defeats the Warsaw Pact. Reagan reads it right when it comes out and just inhales it. As he's flying to Reykjavik 2 months later, he's walking to the back of Air Force One. And so as you approach the summit, you expect that, okay, it's going to be time to really get to the important issues, the throw weights, the missile yields, the numbers, all that. But no, Reagan's not a technical guy anyway. He doesn't like details to begin with. He's not going to get into the depth there. Instead, he wants to talk about this book that he just read, Red Storm Rising. And it's research because, hey, part of it takes place in Iceland because you have a whole narrative about Keflavik Airfield that's going on in the book. And all the staff laughs. Huh, very funny, sir. Good joke. But he wasn't joking. So at the summit, Reagan and Gorbachev famously almost agree to get rid of all nukes within a 10-year window. Only Reagan's insistence on maintaining SDI prevents that. And so this creates some concern among our allies and among our partners, right? Because the main logic was that, well, the US needed nukes more because that was how we beat bigger numbers, right? The Soviets had so much more stuff, so many more tanks, so many more people, that we needed nukes in order to win. And our doctrine called for that. Air-land battle calls for tactical nuclear strikes across the depth of the Soviet formation. And so it's integrated into our war planning at this time. And so Thatcher, Britain's prime minister, is a little concerned that Reagan seems to want to give away this huge advantage. And so he calls him up and is like, hey, great job, except for when you almost destabilize the balance of power in Europe. Not great job on that. And Reagan says, well, I don't see it that way. You should read Red Storm Rising. I think it gives a really good account of where we're at right now. So again, you have the President of the United States telling the Prime Minister of the UK that a book by an insurance agent with no military experience whatsoever is critical to understanding the current state of the balance of power in Europe. That's pretty out there, it seems like. But when you peel it back, there's actually some good things to this. So what the novel is doing is it's taking pretty good level of research. Clancy was accused of writing things that were classified, and there are occasionally times when things that should not have been released pop up in his novels, and he has a way that he thinks makes it unclassified. They can go in there that is not true. We can talk about later if y'all want to. But he's getting access to stuff. And because after Hunt for Red came out, he got to go to Langley, he got to go to Joint Forces Command, he got to go on a submarine and ride a tank and do all this cool military tourism stuff because everyone wanted him to put their stuff into his book. And so it's portrayed realistically enough as you look into that. And it matches a lot of what Reagan is getting from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from the National Security Council, from all these policy briefings. It's not that far out of left field. And critically for Reagan, he doesn't think that they're going to fight the Soviets in 86. So we don't need to win in 86. We need to win in 96, right? When the nukes are gone in that 10-year window. And if you look at the arc, well, then perhaps, right? And so Reagan reads Red Storm Rising like a personal war game, right? Where he's putting himself in the narrative and imagining what this conflict could be and comes to a wildly different, but perhaps not unreasonable conclusion, which then means that what nukes are changes, right? Because Reagan had a long time abhorrence of nuclear weapons, but if you need them to guarantee the balance of power, you tolerate it. If you don't need them, then they're dangerous and apocalyptic, and giving your enemy that power over you is reckless and irresponsible. And then you can't really be free in Reagan's estimation under that, right? He compared MAD like two cowboys in a saloon pointing their guns at each other forever, basically. And so that's a case where, again, I think this imagination really benefits Reagan. And it comes on top of all this other prep, right? All this breadth of briefings, all this other work people like Jack Matlock are doing and trying to make him understand who the Russians are better. There's that depth of knowledge. He runs into problems when he doesn't have that depth of knowledge. Again, I mentioned he loves cowboy novels, right? One of his favorite movies was High Noon, right? So this is a Western, comes out in the early 1950s. Screenwriter was Carl Foreman. I'll get to why that matters in a second, right? But in this story, you have Marshall Cain, played by Gary Cooper, who wins an Oscar for the role, deciding he's going to stay and defend a town against bandits that are coming, despite the town's wishes that he not do this. Basically, the town thinks that if he leaves, then the cause of the bandits to come in there is going to be taken away and it'll be nicer, right? Not necessarily a reasonable belief on their part, the way it's portrayed in the movie. Marshall Cain refuses, right? He stays and he fights off the bandits largely by himself. He has a drunk semi-deputy help him for a little bit, and then his wife, who was previously a pacifist, helps him to take out the main gang leader at the end of this movie. But he prevails, and at the end, all the townspeople come out. They're so grateful and so happy, patting him on the back, and he has this look of disgust on his face. As he reaches up, he takes it off his Marshall Star, throws it down in the dirt, and walks off. To ride off with his wife into their new life where they're going to be owning a store somewhere. And so for Reagan, he would often say he wanted a High Noon type of policy, a Marshall Cain type of policy. And what this meant for him was that he was going to, or the country, was going to do the right thing for the right reasons, regardless of who said anything else, and they'd leave without taking the credit. Problem is that Reagan wildly misinterprets this movie. Because again, I mentioned Carl Foreman as a screenwriter. This is the last project Foreman works off before he is blacklisted for his ties to the Communist Party. And so he wrote this expressly as an allegory about McCarthyism and about the Red Scare in Hollywood. And in his telling, Reagan is certainly not Marshall Cain. Reagan had been a friendly witness to the HUAC, at best is a townsperson to Foreman, but is probably part of the villainous gang in this movie. Right? And so he has wildly misinterpreted this, taken what his preferred framework of a movie was and overlaid it on what it actually was supposed to be. And he does this in parts of the world he doesn't understand very well. All right, you see this particularly in his policy in Nicaragua, right, where he comes in and he wants to make sure we're doing something to fight the Sandinistas, something to go against communism. And if the people that we have to get in bed with to do it aren't that great, well, then we got to hold our noses a little bit. Similarly, in South Africa, he's asking black South Africans to hold off on their demands in the apartheid state because of how important the South African nation is to getting particular minerals in the Cold War struggle. Right? He actually vetoes sanctions on South Africa, and that's overturned when his own party holds the Senate. And so it's not often that you see the president's own party overturn his veto, but it's kind of showing how far off he is because he can't escape this Cold War framework where it's not necessarily appropriate to apply it, right? The Sandinistas were not good people by any stretch, but the Contras were equally bad, if not worse, right? And so they're not white hats and black hats, they're both black hats. And the victims then are the people of Nicaragua who are forced to struggle through that. And that was a nuance and a context that Reagan just didn't have because he didn't seek it out. He wanted stories where the good guys win that reinforced the same narrative of, the lone protagonist comes into town, takes care of business, and then off he goes. And so that shows kind of the dark side of what I'm trying to talk here about the use of fiction, the use of imagination in policy, is that if it's not informed and not supported by more outside information, more diverse points of view, more diverse sources, then it's likely to set up on bad policy and failure, right? And so I think with these two, you see a case of really strong success and a case of really strong failure coming out of this same approach because of the presence of intellectual curiosity in the case of the Soviet Union and Russia, and the absence of that same curiosity when you're looking at the developing world in this time period. And that goes into my kind of larger point that I'll close with before questions of what use is fiction then? And again, to me, fiction is a powerful tool because that imagination, that vision is so important for a leader, so important for a policymaker. If you can't think about the future, think about how you want to achieve the future, and then communicate that well, then you're not going to be able to build that future either because you don't have the right plans in place or that you don't have the right coalition to go forth and do it. And so you need that imagination. You need to be able to think creatively. And fiction, I think, really does help with that. So does wargaming, for example, right? If you want to get on the tabletop, break out some miniatures, I'm a nerd, I love doing all of that, right? But if you are using it in a way that just reconfirms your own biases, if you're just going for that preferred path of, I like this story is just like it, so I'm going to read that one. And this movie is based off of this story, so I'm going to watch that one. Then you're not getting that depth. You're not getting that breadth of understanding and perspective needed to make policy that can survive in what is a really complicated and difficult environment to operate in. And so my last thing is I was very happy that I was able to come to it in this way because I get a joke that I started research for this book when I was 12 years old. Because what happened when I was 12 is I had finished reading all the young adult literature stuff, and I asked my dad for a book, and he reached up and grabbed a copy of Hunt for October and handed it to me. And so that started me reading all of Tom Clancy, started me reading Robert Ludlum and John le Carré, who, by the way, the Reagan administration hated both of them because they didn't have that preferred narrative that was friendly to the Reagan administration of good and virtuous U.S. spies. And then somehow I was able to work everything else I liked into this project as well. That's the Cubs, that's Star Wars, that's science fiction, right? So this is as much about the things that shaped me as it is about the things that shaped Reagan, which I kind of liked as a narrative over top of all of this.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.